An ex-soldier helped an old man cross the street, not realizing he was a decorated war hero. That's what people would say later when they told the story, reducing a life-changing moment to its simplest form. But for James Mercer, that rainy Tuesday in October was the day his broken world began to heal. The rain fell in sheets, transforming the city streets into a blur of gray and reflecting headlights. James hunched his shoulders against the downpour, his worn military jacket offering little protection. 3 years since his discharge, and still the sounds of car horns made his heart hammer against his ribs. Still, the crowds made his palms sweat. Still, he felt like a stranger in the world he'd once belonged to. Water dripped from his close-cropped hair into his eyes as he waited for the crosswalk signal. The apartment he could barely afford waited on the other side of the street. Empty, silent, containing nothing but more hours to fill until sleep might come. His therapist called it progress that he'd managed the job interview today. James called it pointless. The polite smile on the hiring manager's face had said everything. Overqualified, unstable, too many gaps to explain. That's when he saw him, an elderly man standing at the curb, gripping a wooden cane with white-knuckled fingers. The man's raincoat seemed too large for his thin frame, and a folded newspaper protected what little remained of his white hair. But it was the way he stood, ramrod straight despite his obvious frailty, that caught James's attention. The crossing signal changed and people surged forward. The old man took a hesitant step, then froze as a taxi honked impatiently, splashing water onto the curb. James saw the slight tremble in the man's hand, the momentary flash of something familiar in his eyes. Not fear exactly, but a distant cousin to it. Hypervigilance. Recognition. James moved without thinking. "Excuse me, sir. Would you like some help crossing?" The old man's eyes, startlingly blue against his weathered face, assessed James with unexpected sharpness. "I've been crossing streets since before you were born, son," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Then those blue eyes flickered toward the rushing traffic, and something in his expression shifted. "But I suppose today I could use a steady arm." James offered his elbow, and after a moment's hesitation, the old man's hand gripped it with surprising strength. They stepped off the curb together. "Daniel Winters," the man said as they navigated around a puddle. "James Mercer." "Military?" James stiffened, his step faltering. "How did you—" "The haircut, the posture, the way you scanned the street before we crossed?" Daniel's mouth curved slightly. "Old habits." They reached the opposite curb, but Daniel didn't release his arm. Instead, he looked up at the darkening sky, then at James's dripping jacket. "There's a diner around the corner. Decent coffee. Better than standing in this deluge. Join me?" James should have politely declined. He had perfected the art of keeping people at a distance. It was safer that way. But something in the old man's direct gaze made the practiced refusal die in his throat. Sure. Coffee sounds good." The diner was a relic from another era. Red vinyl booths, chrome accents, the hiss of the espresso machine providing a rhythmic backdrop to the murmur of conversation. The warmth inside hit James like a physical wave, making him realize how cold he'd been. They slid into a booth near the back, where Daniel could face the door. Another habit James recognized all too well. A waitress with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair brought menus and poured coffee without being asked. "On the house for you, Mr. Winters," she said, her smile softening the lines around her mouth. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Thank you, Maggie. Been a tough few weeks with the hip." He gestured toward James. "This young man was kind enough to help me across the street." Heat crawled up James's neck. "It wasn't. Anyone would have—" "No," Daniel interrupted, stirring sugar into his coffee. "They wouldn't have. Most people are too busy looking at their phones to notice an old man having a bad day." James wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into his perpetually cold fingers. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows and transforming the world beyond into impressionistic smears. "So," Daniel said after taking a sip of his coffee, "which sandbox were you in?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. James stared into the black surface of his coffee, watching his distorted reflection ripple. "Afghanistan. 3 tours." Daniel nodded, saying nothing, waiting. "Mo been back 3 years," James added, the words feeling rusty from disuse. You. Vietnam. Later, Desert Storm in an advisory capacity. Daniel's eyes grew distant. Different wars, same wounds. Something in James's chest loosened, just slightly. He took a breath that felt deeper than any he'd managed in months. "How long did it take?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. "To feel normal again?" Daniel's weathered hands wrapped around his mug, fingers branched with blue veins and spotted with age. His wedding ring caught the overhead light. "I'll let you know when I get there," he said, and the unexpected honesty startled a laugh from James. Small and rough, but genuine. But it gets quieter. With time, with effort. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain providing a soothing counterpoint to the clink of cutlery and murmured conversations. "I had an interview today," James found himself saying. "Another one where they look at my resume, see special forces, and decide I'm either dangerous or damaged. Or both," Daniel added. "Or both." James agreed, his mouth twisting. 8 years of service, and all I'm qualified for is night security or warehouse work. Daniel studied him over the rim of his mug. "What did you want to be?" Before, the question caught James off guard. Most people asked what he did in the military, what he'd seen, whether he'd killed anyone. Questions he deflected with practiced ease. No one asked about before. "Teacher," he said finally. "History." Daniel's eyebrows rose. "Now that's interesting. Most fellows I know went into the service to escape school, not return to it. I had a teacher in high school, Mr. Andrews, Vietnam vet. He made history feel alive, important." James stared out the window, remembering. "I wanted to do that for other kids. And now?" James shrugged, the movement tight and controlled. "Free. Feels like a different lifetime. Someone else's dream." The waitress returned, refilling their mugs without interrupting their conversation. As she walked away, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I have a proposition for you, James Mercer." James raised an eyebrow, wariness returning. He'd learned to be suspicious of unexpected offers. "My house needs work. Nothing major. Gutters need cleaning, some painting, organizing my garage. My daughter's been after me to hire someone, but I dislike strangers in my space." Daniel's blue eyes held his steadily. "It's temporary work, but it's honest. And private. I don't need charity," James said automatically, his spine stiffening. "Good, because I'm not offering any." Daniel's voice took on a steely edge. "I'm offering fair pay for honest work. You need money. I need help from someone who won't treat me like I'm made of glass." James opened his mouth to refuse, then closed it. His bank account was dangerously close to empty. The rent was due in 2 weeks. "Why me?" he asked instead. "You don't know anything about me." Daniel's mouth curved in a small, knowing smile. "I know you noticed me struggling before anyone else did. I know you offered help with dignity instead of pity. And I know what it's like to be where you are. Overqualified for most jobs and too haunted for the rest." Outside, the rain had eased to a gentle patter, and weak sunlight filtered through breaking clouds. James looked at Daniel's steady gaze, at the rain-washed street beyond, and made a decision that would alter the course of his life. "When do I start?" Daniel Winters lived in a modest 2-story colonial on a tree-lined street in an older neighborhood. The house had good bones, as James's mother would have said, but showed signs of neglect. Gutters sagging with leaves, paint peeling around window frames, an overgrown garden that might once have been carefully tended. James arrived at 8 the next morning, wearing his most presentable jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He stood on the porch for a long moment before knocking, wondering if he'd made a mistake. The door opened before his knuckles connected with the wood. "Watching through the window?" James asked, one corner of his mouth lifting. "Old habits," Daniel replied, stepping back to let him in. He moved carefully, James noticed, favoring his right side. The cane from yesterday was nowhere in sight. The interior of the house told a different story than its exterior. Everything was meticulously organized. Surfaces dust-free, furniture arranged with military precision. Photos lined the entryway. Daniel in uniform at various ages, standing beside a beautiful dark-haired woman, the same woman holding a baby, a young woman who shared Daniel's eyes graduating from college. Family gatherings that spanned decades. "My wife Eleanor," Daniel said, following James's gaze to a portrait of the dark-haired woman. 47 years together before cancer took her 3 years ago. James nodded, unsure what to say. He was out of practice with normal human interaction, with the give and take of conversation. But Daniel didn't seem to mind his silence. "Coffee first, then I'll show you what needs doing," Daniel said, leading the way to a sunny kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Over the next few hours, Daniel outlined the work. Gutters that needed cleaning, a fence that needed mending, boxes in the garage that needed organizing. Simple, straightforward tasks that required physical effort but little specialized knowledge. "I can handle all of this," James said, mentally calculating how many days the work would take. Should I start with the gutters? Daniel nodded, then hesitated. There's one more thing. Not on the list. James waited, sensing the shift in Daniel's demeanor. I need someone to walk with me. Daily if possible. Daniel's voice remained matter-of-fact, but something in his eyes betrayed vulnerability. My doctor insists on exercise for my hip, but my balance isn't what it was. Yesterday wasn't just a bad day with the rain. It's becoming difficult. Understanding dawned on James. This wasn't just about house repairs. You need a walking partner, he said simply. Relief flickered across Daniel's face. Yes, nothing dramatic, just around the neighborhood. Half a mile, maybe a bit more as we build up to it. James nodded, finding himself oddly touched by the request. We can start tomorrow. Early, before it gets too hot. Good. Darn me, good. Daniel straightened, the moment of vulnerability carefully tucked away. Now there's a ladder in the garage. Let's get you set up for those gutters. Over the next week, a routine developed. James would arrive at 7:30, and they would walk together. Slowly at first, with Daniel grudgingly using his cane, then gradually faster and farther as Daniel's confidence grew. Then James would work on the house repairs until late afternoon. Those first walks were mostly silent, both men unused to casual conversation. But gradually, stories began to emerge in fragments. Daniel's childhood in rural Pennsylvania, his first deployment to Vietnam, the day he met Eleanor at a USO dance. She told me I danced like I had 2 left feet, Daniel said one morning as they rounded the corner of his street. Then she proceeded to teach me right there, counting steps out loud until I got it right. Most beautiful woman in the room, spending her time with a gangly kid who couldn't tell his left from his right. She sounds formidable, James said, matching his pace to Daniel's measured steps. That she was. Daniel's smile was soft with memory. Never met a problem she couldn't tackle head on. When I came back from Nam, let's just say I wasn't in good shape. She never flinched. Not once. James nodded, thinking of his own return. There had been no one waiting for him. No wife, no girlfriend, just parents who tried their best but couldn't understand the man who'd returned in place of the boy who'd left. What about you? Daniel asked. Anyone special? James shook his head. There was someone before my last deployment. She couldn't handle the waiting, the not knowing. He kept his voice neutral. Can't blame her. Daniel made a non-committal sound. Some people aren't built for that life. Eleanor used to say that military spouses serve too, just without the uniform. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the morning sun warming their shoulders, birds calling from the massive oak trees that lined the neighborhood streets. Your daughter, James said eventually. You mentioned she's been after you to get help. Melissa, Daniel's expression softened, lives in Boston with her husband and my granddaughter. Calls twice a week like clockwork, visits when she can. Wants me to move into one of those retirement communities. And you don't want to. This house has 40 years of memories. Eleanor's in every corner of it. Daniel's hand tightened on his cane. I'm not ready to let that go. James understood that too well. The need to hold on to the tangible reminders of a better time, even as they slipped through your fingers. As days turned into weeks, the work expanded beyond the original list. James repaired loose shingles, fixed a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink, repainted the front porch, and every morning they walked, a little farther each day, their conversations growing deeper, more meaningful. It was during the 3rd week, as James was organizing boxes in the garage, that he found it. A shadow box containing medals that made his breath catch. A silver star, a bronze star with Valor device, a purple heart. Sir? He called, his voice echoing in the garage. Daniel? Daniel appeared in the doorway, leaning on his cane. His eyes went to the shadow box in James's hands, and something in his expression closed off. I was wondering where that had gotten to. His tone was deliberately casual. Eleanor must have packed it away after the move. James carefully set the box on a workbench, suddenly aware that he'd stumbled onto something deeply personal. I didn't realize these aren't just any medals. The Silver Star alone was one of the highest decorations awarded for valor in combat. James had known men who'd received it posthumously. Daniel shrugged, the gesture at odds with the significance of the medals. Different time, different war. Different time, same courage. James countered quietly. For a moment, Daniel seemed about to dismiss the comment. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he moved into the garage, lowering himself carefully onto a stool near the workbench. We all did what we had to, he said, his fingers tracing the glass over the Silver Star. Some of us were just lucky enough to come home. "What happened?" James asked, then immediately regretted the intrusion. "I'm sorry, you don't have to." "It's all right." Daniel's eyes had taken on that faraway look that James recognized. Looking at the present, but seeing the past. Fire base near the Cambodian border. We were overrun at dawn. Half the unit was down in the first wave. He fell silent, and James didn't press. He understood the way some memories resisted being formed into neat narratives. How they existed instead as fragments of sensation and emotion, too intense to fully articulate. "I dragged 4 men to safety." Daniel finally continued. "Nothing heroic about it, pure instinct and dumb luck. The 5th? His fingers tightened on his cane. "The 5th was my best friend, Thomas Reed. We grew up on the same street, enlisted together. He didn't make it." James said nothing, but he moved to sit on a nearby box, his presence an acknowledgement of a shared understanding that transcended the decades between their wars. "They gave me these," Daniel gestured at the medals, "and sent me home with a piece of shrapnel still in my hip and half my unit in body bags. And that's why you don't talk about it," James said softly. "Why the medals were packed away?" Daniel nodded, his gaze still on the shadow box. "What's there to say? That I was terrified every second? That I still don't know why I survived when better men didn't? That sometimes I dream I'm still there, trying to reach Thomas before the mortar hits?" The words hung in the dusty air of the garage, raw and honest. James felt something shift between them, the final barrier of formality dissolving into something deeper. "I understand," he said simply, because he did. Daniel looked at him then, really looked at him, with eyes that had seen the worst humanity had to offer and somehow still held kindness. "I know you do, son. That's why you're here." The discovery of the medals changed something between them. Their morning walks became occasions for deeper conversation, not just about the wars they'd fought, but about the peace they were struggling to find afterward. "The hardest part," Daniel said one morning as they walked along a creek path behind the neighborhood, "is that everyone expects you to be the same person who left. They don't understand that's impossible." James nodded, remembering his mother's tears when he'd flinched away from her hug upon his return. How his father had tried to engage him in conversations about sports teams he no longer cared about. "My therapist calls it moral injury," James said, stepping over a fallen branch. "The disconnect between who you were and what you've done. What you've seen." Daniel considered this, his pace steady on the smooth path. "In my day, they didn't have names for it. You either drank it away or you buried it. Neither works, for the record." "What did work? For you?" Daniel was quiet for several steps. The only sound the crunch of gravel under their feet and the gentle murmur of the creek beside them. "Eleanor," he said finally. "Work, structure, finding purpose again." He glanced at James. "And time, more time than you'd think." They rounded a bend in the path, and the creek widened into a small pond where ducks floated serenely on the still water. "The dreams are the worst," James admitted, the words easier to say while looking at the water rather than at Daniel. "Not even nightmares, really. Just being back there. Feeling the same things. Waking up and not knowing where I am. Those fade," Daniel said. "Or change, at least. Become less frequent." Yeah. Daniel stopped walking, turning to face James fully. "Listen to me, James. It gets better. Not perfect. Not the same as before, but better. I promise you that." Something about the fierce certainty in the old man's voice reached a part of James that therapy sessions and support groups hadn't touched. Perhaps because Daniel had walked the same path decades before and emerged intact. Perhaps because of the simple human connection between them that required no explanations or justifications. "I believe you," James said, and realized with surprise that he meant it. As September faded into October, the work on Daniel's house neared completion. The gutters were clean, the fence mended, the garage organized. The exterior gleamed with fresh paint, and inside small repairs had given the old house new life. Their walks had extended to nearly 2 miles, and Daniel rarely used his cane anymore. His stride had grown stronger, more confident, and occasionally he even suggested a more challenging route with hills that would have been impossible for him weeks earlier. During their walks and over shared lunches, James had learned the contours of Daniel's life. 30 years of military service, followed by a decade teaching military history at the community college. 47 years of marriage to Eleanor, who'd been a nurse and later a hospital administrator. 1 daughter, Melissa, who'd rebelled against the military lifestyle by becoming an environmental lawyer, and a 3-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, who was the light of Daniel's life. And Daniel had learned about James, his childhood in a small town in Ohio, the history teacher who'd inspired him, the idealism that had led him to enlist after 9/11, and the 3 tours that had left him hollow-eyed and sleepless. He'd learned about James's struggles to find steady work, his isolation from former friends who couldn't relate to his experiences, and his dwindling hope of ever becoming the teacher he'd once dreamed of being. What neither of them acknowledged was that their arrangement had an endpoint, that soon there would be no more work to justify James's daily presence. It was Daniel who finally broached the subject one evening as they sat on his newly repaired front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "The house looks better than it has in years," he said, his hands resting comfortably on the arms of his rocking chair. "Eleanor would be pleased." James nodded, feeling an unexpected tightness in his throat. "Just the back bedroom left to paint, and we're done." Daniel was quiet for a moment, rocking gently as a cool autumn breeze stirred the colorful leaves of the maple tree in the front yard. "Melissa's coming to visit next weekend," he said, "bringing Sophie." "That's great," James said, genuinely pleased. Daniel spoke of his daughter and granddaughter often, his love for them evident in every story. "I know you've been looking forward to seeing them." "I have." Daniel's rocking slowed. "Melissa wants to meet you." James turned to look at him, surprised. "Me? Why?" A small smile played at the corners of Daniel's mouth. "Because I talk about you. Because for the first time since her mother died, she's heard me sound like myself again." The simple honesty of the statement washed over James like warm water, both comforting and overwhelming. "Oh," he said inadequately. Daniel chuckled. "Eloquent as always, Mercer." James smiled, but it faded quickly. "After the painting is done?" "Yes," Daniel said, understanding the unfinished question. "I've been thinking about that." He stopped rocking and turned to face James fully, his expression serious. "I made some calls," he said. "The community college where I used to teach has an opening for a part-time history instructor starting next semester. Entry level, teaching Western civilization to freshmen who'd rather be anywhere else." James stared at him, not comprehending. "That's good?" "It could be for someone with a bachelor's degree in history and real-world experience that brings perspective to historical events." Daniel held his gaze steadily. "Someone like you." The world seemed to tilt slightly as understanding dawned. I haven't taught before," James stammered. "I don't have a teaching certificate. Community colleges have different requirements than public schools. And Jack Reynolds, he's the department chair, an old friend. He's willing to take my recommendation." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "It's one class, James. A starting point." Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, flickered to life in James's chest. "Huh? Why would you do this for me?" "Because you helped an old man cross the street," Daniel said simply. "And because good teachers are born, not made. I've watched you explain historical context for current events. Heard your passion when you talk about the patterns in history. You have the gift for it." James looked out at the deepening twilight, trying to process the unexpected opportunity. For so long, he'd existed in a holding pattern, just getting through each day. The idea of taking a step toward the future he'd once imagined seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. "I don't know what to say," he admitted finally. "Say you'll think about it," Daniel replied. "Say you'll meet with Jack next week. The rest will follow." James nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside him, something that had been frozen beginning to thaw. "I'll think about it," he promised. And ... "Thank you." Daniel waved away the thanks. "That's what friends do, son. They see possibilities in each other that we sometimes can't see in ourselves. Friends." The words settled comfortably between them as they sat in companionable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Melissa Winters arrived on a crisp Saturday morning with 3-year-old Sophie in tow, a whirlwind of energy that transformed Daniel's quiet house in an instant. James, who had planned to make himself scarce during the family visit, found himself firmly invited to dinner that evening. "Dad talks about you constantly," Melissa said when she called to insist on his presence. "Sophie's already asking when she gets to meet Grandpa's friend James." So at 6 o'clock, James found himself standing on Daniel's porch again, this time with a bottle of wine and an unfamiliar nervousness. He'd spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear, finally settling on the one pair of slacks he owned and a blue button-down shirt that his mother had sent him for Christmas. The door flew open before he could knock, revealing a tiny figure with Daniel's startling blue eyes and dark curls. "Are you James?" the little girl demanded, hands on her hips in a posture so reminiscent of her grandfather that James had to smile. I am, he confirmed solemnly. And you must be Sophie. She nodded, clearly pleased that he knew who she was. Grandpa says you were a soldier like him. I was, James said, unsure how much more to say to a 3-year-old about such matters. Sophie seemed satisfied with this confirmation. Okay, you can come in now. She reached for his hand with the natural trust of a child, tugging him into the house. We're having lasagna. The evening was nothing like James had expected. Melissa turned out to be warm and funny, with her father's direct gaze and her mother's dark hair, now streaked with early silver. She treated James not as a stranger or her father's employee, but as someone already woven into the fabric of Daniel's life. Sophie, for her part, decided that James was her new favorite person, especially after he helped her build an elaborate fort out of sofa cushions and blankets while the adults prepared dinner. She's usually shy with new people, Melissa commented as she watched her daughter chattering away to James about her preschool adventures. You must have the magic touch. James shook his head, still bemused by the child's instant acceptance. I don't have much experience with kids. Could have fooled me, Melissa said, passing him a glass of wine. Then again, Dad's a pretty good judge of character. If he likes you, that's recommendation enough. After Sophie was tucked into bed in the guest room, the 3 adults settled in the living room with coffee and the remnants of the apple pie Melissa had brought. So James, Melissa said, curling her legs under her on the sofa, Dad tells me you're considering teaching at Riverside Community College. James shot Daniel a look. I'm exploring the possibility. Your father seems to think I'd be good at it. He's excellent at recognizing potential. Melissa agreed. It's how he ended up with half a dozen protégés scattered across academia. She tilted her head, studying him with the same directness her father possessed. But, what made you want to teach? James considered the question, aware of Daniel watching him from his armchair. History gives us context, he said finally. It helps us understand why things are the way they are, how patterns repeat, how change happens. After what I've seen overseas, I think that understanding is more important than ever. Melissa nodded, something approving in her expression. The students would be lucky to hear that perspective. The conversation flowed easily after that, touching on politics, Melissa's environmental law practice, Daniel's neighbors, and a dozen other topics. James found himself laughing more than he had in years, drawn into the warm circle of their family dynamic without effort. Later, as he was preparing to leave, Melissa pulled him aside near the front door. I want to thank you, she said quietly, her eyes serious. For what? For whatever you did that brought my father back. She glanced toward the living room, where Daniel was dozing lightly in his armchair. After Mom died, he just faded, went through the motions. I've been terrified for 3 years that he was just waiting to join her. James shook his head. I didn't do anything special. Just some house repairs, daily walks. Melissa smiled, squeezing his arm gently. You did something no one else could. You understood what he was going through. Soldier to soldier. He helped me more than I helped him, James admitted. That's probably true, Melissa acknowledged. Being needed again, having purpose, that's the best medicine for someone like Dad. She hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I think you'll be an amazing teacher. The simple vote of confidence from a woman who barely knew him warmed something in James's chest. Thanks, he said. I'm starting to think maybe I could be. The interview with Jack Reynolds, the history department chair at Riverside Community College, was scheduled for the following Wednesday. As the day approached, James's anxiety mounted. He revised his resume endlessly, researched the college online, and spent hours practicing answers to potential interview questions. The morning of the interview, he arrived at Daniel's house at the usual time for their walk, his stomach in knots. You look like you're heading to your execution, not a job interview, Daniel observed as they set out along their usual route. James tried to smile. That obvious, huh? Only to someone who's known you for months. Daniel's pace was brisk today, confidence in every step. Want to talk about what's really bothering you? They walked in silence for a minute, the familiar rhythm of their footsteps on the pavement oddly calming. What if I can't do it? James finally said. What if I freeze up in front of the class? Or they ask questions I can't answer, or the sky might fall, Daniel interrupted dryly. Or aliens might invade during your first lecture. Despite himself, James chuckled. I'm being ridiculous. Only a little. Daniel conceded. First-time nerves are normal. But James, he stopped walking, turning to face him. You've faced far worse than a classroom of college freshmen. Different kind of challenge, James pointed out. True, but the same courage applies. Daniel started walking again, and James fell into step beside him. Besides, teaching is like anything else. You get better with practice. My first lecture was a disaster. Spilled coffee on my notes, forgot half of what I meant to say, and called the Peloponnesian War the Napoleonic War. You did not, James said, unable to imagine the precise, articulate man beside him making such an error. God's honest truth, Daniel insisted. The point is, I survived. The students survived. And eventually, I got good at it. He glanced at James. You will too. They completed their walk in comfortable silence. And as they approached Daniel's house, James felt his anxiety settling into something more manageable. A healthy nervousness rather than paralyzing fear. Thanks, he said as they reached the front porch. For everything. Daniel waved away the thanks. Go home and get ready for your interview. And James, his blue eyes were serious. Remember that you're not just an ex-soldier. You're a man with a future. The words stayed with James as he showered and dressed in his best clothes, as he drove to the college campus, as he waited in the reception area outside the history department offices. You're a man with a future. Jack Reynolds turned out to be a burly man in his 60s with a salt and pepper beard and an infectious laugh. He greeted James with a firm handshake and immediately put him at ease with his straightforward manner. Daniel Winters doesn't give his stamp of approval lightly, Reynolds said as they settled in his cluttered office. When he called me about you, I knew I needed to meet you myself. The interview was more conversation than interrogation. Questions about James's education, his interest in history, his perspective on teaching adult learners. There were the expected questions about his military service, handled with sensitivity, and unexpected ones about his favorite historical periods and figures. We're not looking for someone with decades of teaching experience, Reynolds explained as the interview wound down. We're looking for someone who can connect with our students, many of whom are first-generation college students or returning adults. Someone who understands that history isn't just dates and battles, but the story of human experience. James nodded, feeling more confident with each passing minute. That's exactly how I see it. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, studying James thoughtfully. The position we're discussing is for one section of History 101, starting in January. It's part-time and frankly, the pay isn't great, but it's a foot in the door. That's all I'm looking for, James said honestly. Good. Reynolds stood, extending his hand again. Because the job is yours if you want it. James blinked, certain he'd misheard. What? Just like that? Reynolds chuckled. I've been doing this a long time, Mr. Mercer. I know potential when I see it. And besides, his eyes twinkled. Daniel would never forgive me if I let you slip away. The drive back to Daniel's house passed in a blur, James's mind racing with possibilities. A teacher. He was going to be a teacher. The dream he'd set aside years ago was suddenly, improbably, within reach. Daniel was waiting on the porch when James pulled up, his expression carefully neutral until he saw James's face. Well, he called as James bounded up the steps, energy coursing through him like electricity. I got it, James said, his voice catching slightly. One section of History 101, starting in January. Daniel's face broke into a wide smile, years falling away from his features. I knew it. Didn't I tell you? Jack Reynolds is no fool. Without thinking, James pulled the older man into a quick, fierce hug. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion, for believing in me before I could believe in myself. Daniel returned the embrace, his grip surprisingly strong, before stepping back with a suspiciously brightness in his eyes. This calls for a celebration, he declared. I have a bottle of scotch Eleanor would scold me for opening without a proper occasion. Later, as they sat on the porch with glasses of amber liquid catching the late afternoon sunlight, James found himself thinking about the strange series of events that had led him here. A rainy day, an old man at a crosswalk, a simple act of kindness that had somehow altered the trajectory of his life. Penny for your thoughts, Daniel said, interrupting his reverie. James smiled, looking out at the quiet street where neighborhood children were playing before dinner. I was just thinking about that day we met. If it hadn't been raining, if I'd taken a different route home. Ah, the great what-ifs of life. Daniel mused. I've spent too many hours on those myself. It just seems so random. That moment that changed everything. Daniel considered this, swirling the scotch in his glass. Maybe, or maybe not so random at all. What do you mean? I mean that life has a way of putting the right people in our paths when we need them most. Daniel's gaze was distant, reflective. I didn't just need help crossing a street that day, James. I needed a reason to keep moving forward. Eleanor had been gone 3 years and I was just existing, not living. James nodded, understanding completely. And you, Daniel continued, you needed someone who understood what you were carrying. Someone who could see past the labels. Veteran, ex-soldier. To the man underneath who still had dreams worth pursuing. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The only sounds the distant shouts of playing children and the gentle creak of Daniel's rocking chair. So what now? James asked finally. Daniel smiled, raising his glass slightly. Now we keep walking forward. Together. James lifted his own glass in response, feeling the warmth of the scotch and something larger. Hope, perhaps, or simply the knowledge that he was no longer alone on his journey. Together, he agreed. The first day of the spring semester dawned cold and clear. A perfect January morning with frost glittering on bare tree branches and steam rising from rooftops as the sun climbed higher. James stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. His reflection showed a different man than the one who had hunched through the rain 6 months earlier. Shoulders straight, eyes clear, purpose evident in the set of his jaw. His phone chimed with a text message. You'll do great. Remember to breathe. Surendi, James smiled, typing back a quick thanks. Before gathering his materials, textbook, lecture notes, the leather messenger bag Daniel had given him as a professor starter kit at Christmas. The drive to campus was quick in the light early morning traffic. James found his assigned classroom easily, a medium-sized room with rows of desks facing a whiteboard and podium. He arrived 45 minutes early, needing time to settle his nerves and organize his thoughts before students began arriving. To his surprise, Jack Reynolds appeared in the doorway 20 minutes before class was scheduled to begin. Thought I'd stop by and wish you luck, the department chair said, leaning against the doorframe. First day jitters? James nodded, arranging his notes on the podium. A few, Reynolds smiled knowingly. They'll fade quickly enough. Once you start talking about something you love, the rest falls away. He straightened, preparing to leave. Oh, and you have a visitor waiting in the hallway. Said he didn't want to intrude. James looked up, confused, and then understood as Daniel appeared in the doorway, leaning on his cane more for show than necessity these days. I hope you don't mind, Daniel said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. I wanted to see where you'll be teaching. Warmth spread through James's chest. Of course I don't mind. Come in. Daniel entered the classroom, looking around with the critical eye of a fellow educator. Good space, natural light, not too many places for students to hide while they text. James laughed. I'll keep that in mind. Daniel made his way to the front of the room, examining the podium and whiteboard with approval. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object and placed it on the podium. A tradition in my family, he explained. My father gave me this before my first day of teaching. Said it was for luck, though I think we both know better than to rely on luck alone. James picked up the object, a small bronze compass, its face aged to a warm patina, still functional after what must have been decades. Daniel, I can't. You can and you will, Daniel interrupted firmly. It's a reminder that even when you feel lost, you have an internal compass that will guide you true. The simple gift, weighted with meaning and history, threatened to undo James's careful composure. He closed his fingers around the compass, feeling its solidity, its connection to the past and now to his future. Thank you, he managed, his voice rough with emotion. Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. I should go. Your students will be arriving soon. As if on cue, young voices echoed in the hallway, signaling the approach of the first students. Daniel squeezed James's shoulder and moved toward the door. Daniel, James called after him. Our walk tomorrow morning? The usual time. The old man smiled, straightening to his full height, the decorated war hero visible for a moment beneath the grandfatherly exterior. The usual time, he confirmed. I'll be waiting. As Daniel left, students began filtering into the classroom, eyeing their new instructor with the usual mix of curiosity and indifference. James placed the compass carefully beside his notes and took a deep breath. Looking out at the faces before him, young, diverse, full of potential, he felt a sense of rightness, of having found his place in the world again. The anxiety that had knotted his stomach all morning dissolved, replaced by a calm certainty. Good morning, he said, his voice strong and clear. My name is James Mercer, and this is History 101. Before we dive into the course material, I'd like to talk about why history matters, not just as a collection of facts and dates, but as a living, breathing story that helps us understand who we are and where we're going. As he spoke, James felt the final pieces of his broken world settling into place, reforming into something new and whole. He thought of the rainy day 6 months ago, of an old man at a crosswalk, of one small act of kindness that had changed everything. Sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes crossing a street can mean crossing from one life into another. And sometimes the heroes we need most aren't the ones on battlefields, but the ones who show us the way home.